Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the February 2022 meeting of Triangle Association of Freelancers. My name is Don Vaughan, and joining us this evening, we have a wonderful guest in Nancy Naglin. Nancy is the publisher and editor of VideoScope Magazine, a quarterly publication, print magazine, devoted to all aspects of genre, film, and television. So please welcome Nancy Naglin. Nancy, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Really appreciate it. I want to talk more in depth about what VideoScope is all about. It's your editorial needs, etc. But I don't think we can talk about the magazine without first talking about Joe Kane, your late husband, who's a film critic, and he started VideoScope. Tell us a little bit about Joe's writing background. He had a really interesting career through his life with various publications. Tell us about that and kind of what led up to the formation of VideoScope.
Well, when we were approximately the same age. He graduated Queen's College around 69, and I graduated McGill University in Canada, in Montreal. We were talking about that earlier, in 71. And at that time, almost everybody we knew, everybody wanted to write. Everybody wanted to write a novel, and everybody wanted a literary career. And film was difficult. It was expensive to get into. It was mysterious as to how you entered the world of cinema, but everybody wanted to write. And we both, in our different spheres, won in our final year of college the writing prize. He at Queens and me at McGill. And when we both met years later, we talked about that, because that was the first validation that someone would pay us for a story. You're filled with trepidation. Is my work good? And it sealed for both of us this idea, which was easier to think about than to accomplish, which is, yes, we will be writers. And Joe started in New York since he was at Queens. And at that time, well, let's put it simply, the word was king and print ruled. There were millions of magazines, and particularly with the youth culture, everybody, now you would have a website, then you had a magazine. And in New York, a lot of the printers, people who had ideas for a magazine, they would go to a printer and they would say, we don't have any money to print it, but give us an extension. Maybe this thing will take off and you can have a piece of the ownership. And if it doesn't take off, let us limp along and we'll pay you back as we print as we go. And the printers were very open to this, because there was a lot of potential to make money in print. That's hard to believe now, but you could make money in print. So Joe, let me talk about Joe. Right after college, he tried to get his writing career established, and he wrote for the underground press. There in New York City, there was something called the New York Ace. A friend of his started it. They put out 9 tabloid issues. It's highly collectible now. There were a million, like there was something called the Soho Weekly News that came later in the 70s, but there were a million of catchy kind of magazines and tabloids. One was called International Insanity, Reliable Source. Joe wrote for all of these, and it was a way to learn how to write satire, fiction, humor, even comic strips. They would review restaurants, they'd review books. They did everything. And then alongside this, there was a huge press for softcore porn. And they were hungry for writers. And Joe and his crowd ended up writing for them, satire pieces, what have you. And then there was a graphics design team. The 2 guys had, again, this was something that was all over New York City, small graphic design shops. And you ask yourself now, why do you need so many small graphic design shops? And that's because there was no Photoshop, no desktop publishing. Anytime you wanted to buy just a brochure, if you wanted to make a brochure, whether for a restaurant or for a PR client, and you wanted to have a paragraph of type, you had to go to a type house and purchase the type, and then have someone proofread it, and then you would get a galley back and proofread the galley. It was a tedious process, and it employed a lot of people. So these little graphic design houses serviced this print industry. And there were two guys, they were known by their last name, Brill and Waldstein. And they were doing a lot of the graphics work for these softcore magazines, that small advertising clients. And they got this idea, cuckoo as it sounds, that they would put out a tabloid called the Monster Times. And it would be devoted to things like Godzilla and Japanese horror films and the werewolf films and Christopher Lee, stuff like that. And somehow Joe connected with them through the softcore porn business, and they said, Joe, come in and be the editor of this. So Joe became the editor of something called the Monster Times. Just to give you an idea of a small little tabloid, what their circulation was 200,000, and it was nationwide. And Joe treated the job kind of like, this pays the rent while I try to get my writing career established. He was running around trying to get pieces in Esquire, which he never succeeded, but he got into places like We, Penthouse, Playboy. And these magazines, as you all know, they in addition to whatever else they were running, how to buy wine, how to impress a woman, what's a good car, they were running serious pieces of political commentary and fiction. So it was a big deal to get into these magazines, and Joe sold them a short story, and he was very proud of that. And so he never really treated the Monster Times very seriously, but in hindsight, the people who read it, they now have a Facebook page where they make up and design new covers that are in the style of the Monster Times. They love this publication. And again, it's highly collectible. And Joe was known as the editor of the Monster Times. So I connected with Joe in the very late 70s. I was doing a lot of freelance work. I was writing for Crawdaddy magazine, interviewing people like Carly Simon. I personally, just as a digression, was frustrated because it was a guy's world, and it would seem to me, no matter how well you wrote, they liked to give, the editors were men, and they liked to give the assignments to the people they knew who were men. So it was tough. You really had to push to get assignments. And so I connected with Joe, and a friend of his was working at the time at the Daily News. And by 1984, the Daily News, which had a huge circulation, they along with the other big newspapers nationwide, weren't too interested in hiring our generation. They felt we don't need these hippies in here, and we don't like their attitude, and they don't go with the flow, and we don't need them, period. Just leave them outside. And they weren't hiring, and they weren't catering to our tastes. And then around 1984, they suddenly woke up and they took a look at the demographic, and they said, if we don't attract the younger demographic, we could go extinct. This is bad business. So they started, this wasn't just the news, a lot of the papers, they started to get hip, and they looked around and they said, let's take a look at this underground press that we spurn. Maybe they got some things that we ought to be covering, like expanded entertainment coverage, more movie pieces, more pieces about film. Film is becoming increasingly popular and important. We should pay more attention. So the news, which was kind of gimmicky, said, let's think up something. Let's have a secret reviewer called the Phantom. We'll call him the Phantom of the movies. And this was before VHS, so the theaters were big in New York, as they were all around the country. If you wanted to see a film, you had to go to the theater. And if you missed it, well, that's tough luck, because you might never see it again, maybe in a drive-in or who knows when. And that's why a lot of film books, people may remember, there were a lot of film books. Joe had quite a collection of these, of movies that would show description of the plot, and then they would actually show black and white photo stills of scenes, because you couldn't see the movie, so you'd look at the pictures. So they hired Joe, and Joe immediately he brought to the Daily News that sort of irreverent style, but very well written style. It was witty, it was well constructed, that he was using at the Monster Times, and that came from the underground press. And it was an immediate hit. They promoted it with T-shirts. He had a contest every week where people would write in. The contest was called "Wish I'd Said That," and they would write in a catchy comment from a movie that had a twist to it, that was funny, that would make you laugh, or that would make you think of the film. And he would pick a winner every week, and the winner would get a T-shirt, and the T-shirt would have a logo, Phantom of the Movies. And on the back, it would say, "Is he sitting next to you?" So this became a very popular column. And then when VHS started, he did another column called Mondo Video, where he started to review films that were available for rent. I don't know about anybody else, but the generation that grew up on VHS, like Tarantino, they're nostalgic for that period, for the period of going to rent. Joe's generation was nostalgic for the horror films of the 50s. The people now who are in their 40s, they're getting nostalgic for the 80s. That's the way it works. So things were going along. Joe thought Joe was thrilled writing at the News. And then beginning in the 80s, the late 80s, the News started to suffer problems. There were strikes. It was owned, it eventually ended up being owned by Maxwell, who was the father of, I think her name is pronounced Ghislaine Maxwell, who's wrapped up with this Epstein tragedy. And it turned out that he also was a flim-flam artist. So the News shut down for a while because of financial problems. And during this period, desktop publishing had come in and lots of zines were popping up. There were millions of zines. Suddenly a zine strictly for Frankenstein. Some of this stuff looked like it was being created in somebody's basement. Some of the stuff was stapled together and some of the stuff was slick. It was a very exciting time. And so the News went out on strike and they were out for a long time. And I said to Joe, maybe we should start a zine since there's no work at the News. Maybe we could start this up and get some News subscribers to come along. And so when the paper started up again, he announced in his column that he was starting VideoScope Magazine. And he told people that how much it cost. And to our amazement, people started to send in checks. So then suddenly we were in the publishing business ourselves. Now, luckily, Joe, he had worked on magazines. He'd worked on tabloids. He could keep, like, how you can do mental arithmetic, and some people need a calculator to do the checkbook, and some people can just add it up in their head. Joe could add up, he could do layouts in his head and keep track of multiple articles, things that were in progress for editing, things that were laid out. He could remember what was on page 33. If he would ask me what's on page 38, I'd say, I don't know. I have to go look at the dummy, and I'd look through our papers. He'd say, oh, I know what's on there, and he would know. So we started VideoScope small, and there was a learning curve because I went into a Barnes and Noble at Sheridan Square in the Village in New York, and I came in with some VideoScopes, and I asked to speak to the manager, and he introduced me to the periodicals manager. This also, I have to pause. Stores now have such a paltry selection on the newsstand, but at that time, every store had a resident periodicals manager just to manage the flow of magazines, the Barnes and Noble. And I said to him, I'd like you to, can I interest you in carrying VideoScope? And he said to me, I'd love to carry it, but it's not my decision. You have to go through certain channels and have a distributor. You have to get distribution, and the distributors distribute to the retail outlets. And through my conversation with him, I went home and I realized, if we do this, we have to get serious on the business side. So at that time, there were maybe about a dozen distributors that dealt with a category of magazine called specialty. Specialty magazine is a small magazine, sometimes called boutique. It's not the size of like Time, what Newsweek was, or Good Housekeeping. Specialty. And they took us on, and very shortly thereafter, we ended up being over 600 Barnes and Noble stores, which is what we maintained. But let me just add, the pressures on on magazines right now, big or small, are two things. Advertising is deserting print; they're going to going online, and distribution is continually shrinking. Barnes and Noble right now is the last big place to sell magazines. I go to the supermarket. We have a chain called Wegmans, and they have a small rack, and the selection that you can buy on the rack is small, unless you go to a big store like Barnes and Noble. So that's why we started. And then I'll tell you something very funny. We were new to desktop publishing. We were using Microsoft Publisher, and neither Joe nor I could figure out how to indent to start a paragraph. We couldn't figure it out. So Joe said, what's the difference? Let's not indent. Otherwise, we'll never get this thing out if we can't figure out how to indent. Let's just lay out the copy and get rolling. So if you look at VideoScope, one of its idiosyncrasies is none of the paragraphs are indented to this day. That's become our style because we didn't know how to do it.
Nancy,
And I think that's common. That's how stuff gets rolling.
I really appreciate you mentioning the Monster Times. I picked it up when I was a lot younger with issue 10. I now have a complete collection, and I'm proud that I have an article about the magazine itself in the current issue of Retro Fan Magazine, published by Tomorrow's Publishing. I also wanted to tell you that even though Joe and I never met in person or even talked on the telephone, he was one of the nicest and most considerate editors I've ever worked with. A genuinely nice person who seemed very respectful of his writers. And that meant a lot to me. It really did.
Well, thank you for saying that. Joe we've been at the other receiving end where, boxes of rejection letters, some curt, some nice, some not. Joe was thrilled with the team of the VideoScope editorial team. They show great enthusiasm and knowledge of everything film, and that was Joe. I think you summed him up. That's how he was in person. This publishing can have some rough edges. Joe was a particularly cordial and friend. Everybody liked Joe, including me.
I actually had intended to talk with him, to interview him about his time at Monster Times, and that was right before he became ill, and we were never able to have that conversation, and I deeply regret that. I really do.
There's a magazine called Little Shop of Horrors. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
I used that article a lot for my own, for that, in addition to talking to Gary Girani and a lot for my own collection. But yeah, the Little Shop of Horrors piece was very informative for me. It's a great article, and I know Joe was quoted in that piece as well. Joe
was, when he was working there, he was trying to get his life rolling. He was trying to get his literary life rolling. He was a much younger person, and he seemed always pressed for time. But in looking back, it was a very formative and a fun time. These Brill and Wallstein guys were kind of characters. They would work side by side at one of those like slanted graphics tables where they would be working usually with a knife, cutting things in and out to paste down. Everything was paced down. And one of them was sort of the boss of the other, and he'd be doing that, and he'd be talking about, where's this invoice? Why wasn't this paid? We need another 200 words. Joe, I'm short. Give me 50 words. 50, I don't know, write something about Godzilla. Give me 200 words on Godzilla because I've got his leg up in the air. And if you give too much, I can trim it around and it will look great around his leg. That's how he would talk. And Joe said it was just nuts, a very nutty kind of atmosphere, but they put out something that's highly
and a lot of great writers got their start there.
Yes.
A lot of great who went on to write for National Lampoon and all different kinds of publications. I mean, it was a really important magazine for a goofy little monster tabloid, but it played a role.
That's Nancy, another thing. Yeah,
I'm sorry?
Let me just add, a lot of the writers were in Joe's circle, and they would cycle through that. Someone would get landed at National Lampoon, and then suddenly they were all writing. Then that guy would get fired, and he'd go, someone else would get a job, and then they'd all flock there. That's how it worked.
Let's talk about the VideoScope today. I'd like to begin by asking you, explain very briefly what you see as the magazine's mission as a publication.
Well, I think the mission has changed a little bit. When Joe first started it, it was very timely. We came out quarterly, and we had something called the new release shelf, and the stuff on the new release shelf, new releases, were really new release. But a quarterly publication can't compete with a lot of the online review sites who are, review stuff the moment it comes out. So our mission has changed a little bit. I want to just say this. There's one of the things that Joe insisted upon in a very organic way, and which is carried forward, is is we have what I would call a very high literary standard for a film magazine. Our writing is good, and it's not sloppy, and it's written. A lot of the on-site reviews are what I call a form of writing. I call it, it's like conversation writing. It's as if two people are talking or one person speaks. It's not formal. It's I like this film because, or this was hilarious. And we don't write that way. We write structured pieces. And the trick to it is and this was Joe's contribution in his generation as well, is that you've had training and you know how to put paragraphs together. It's just like a painter who's been trained in a representational style who suddenly becomes abstract. You know where to pick your moments to make the language loose or your observations loose, so that it's very accessible and conversational. But the form of it is solid writing, and all our writers are very good. So our mission now is to pick our moments. We can't be the most timely and review everything as it comes out. So we pick. We stay to our thematically, this spring issue was an action issue. So we look at action movies, past and present, including Jean-Paul Belmondo, who's a real action figure. He's French. He's not in the American scene, but his contribution is part of that decade where he was active, 70s, 80s. And our readers seem to love it. They seem to like the assemblage that we put together. We call ourselves the ultimate genre guide. So and right across the top of the magazine, it says things like horror, sci-fi, art house, exploitation. We cover a little bit of everything. And it's a good mix. And we review a few books too.
And soundtracks too, I think. Music occasionally.
Yes, we run occasionally something called scoring session, where we take a look at the musical scores that accompany films, anything related to film. And of course, let me tell everybody, Don has contributed some great pieces. He did a piece on behind the scenes people, one of the most expert wig makers. We learned all about how people get their hair arranged for their role, or what's required if it's a special role with hair, wigs, everything.
Paul Huntley was amazing. He was a really, really interesting interview. And another that you allowed me to do was an interview with Margaret Hamilton's son. Margaret Hamilton, the actress who played the Wicked Witch of the West in the 1939 version of The Wizard of Oz. And her son had some remarkable insight into his mom and Hollywood during that era. And also another that I allowed to do was interviewing Mo Howard's son, Mo Howard of the Three Stooges. So, I mean, that's the kind of unique opportunity that a magazine like VideoScope offers its writers. And I just enjoy those opportunities tremendously.
Well, we have if it's connected to film and it's of interest, we're interested in it. That's what VideoScope is about. And you pick it up and you'll find in there, our readers have told us they may not be interested in every article, but there's usually at least one article that they're very interested in, and then the rest of the stuff is of interest as well. But that's the way it works.
I think one point of interest about the magazine that makes it unique, and also of interest to outside contributors, is that you let your writers talk about their personal experiences. I'm thinking of Bill Timoni, for example, talking about doing his voiceover work in various motion pictures, and the other gentleman who had a long career as a theater projectionist, who had some great stories. And you've even allowed me to have some personal essays. I wrote about my experience as an usher at a theater palace in my hometown as a teenager, autograph collecting, profiles of individuals like Forrest Ackerman. And those were ideas that I pitched and you said yes to. So I just wanted to mention that to those who are watching this, that this is really wide open, as long as it has something to do with movies in some capacity. I mentioned in the introduction, Nancy, that you kind of put an emphasis on genre films. Could you very, very quickly elaborate just a little bit on what that means?
Oh, okay. That title has been around for a while. it means these are films that are under the radar for a particular reason. They're not necessarily coming from Hollywood. They're not the blockbusters. They may be films that were a little outre, considered a little outre in past decades, and have been re-released on DVD or Blu-ray or on VOD right now. They may be films from sci-fi or horror, sci-fi horror specialties that were popular in the 60s, 70s that people love, and they want to know all about them, want to see them again. And of course, these films are put out with new commentary. So when you listen to sometimes the commentary is terrific. You learn things about these films that from an insider's point of view, from the director's point of view, he'll talk about the problems he had making it or what difficulties he had with actors. So that's all new, even though they're older films, they're new. And horror right now for young film directors is it seems to be the go-to genre to get a career started. So we do try to cover some of the newer releases that are new horror films from some of the new directors to see where they're taking horror. But genre just means it used to mean off the beaten track. Things like Conan the Barbarian. That's a genre film. Spartacus, for example, is not a genre film. Conan the Barbarian is, if you can see the difference. Spartacus was a mainstream film with a mainstream director, and the history of the screenwriter. But this stuff is sometimes low budget. Sometimes it was stuff that wasn't taken seriously in the decade that it came out. Again, it may have been exploitation, so it was a little on the fringe, either because of a sexual subject or a racial subject or a violent subject. But what's happened, this has also happened in the course of Joe's career, was a lot of these films, these outre films, another genre is Blaxploitation, which would be the films of the 70s that had all black casts that suddenly, like Shaft, for example, that did terrific. But these are the kinds of films where previous film critics of the generation before Joe and me would be very disparaging of. And in fact, and sometimes they would review some of these films, and you look at their reviews and how these films are treated now, and you feel that they really missed the boat. But they were judging these films according to the social mores that they were living in, and times have changed. So a lot of these fringe movies that were around the edges have moved to the center. And you could even argue that the whole concept of an underground film or an outre subject or something that's subversive just doesn't exist anymore. There's no topic that's taboo. There's no sexual activity, depraved or otherwise, that can't be shown on screen. There's no violence has gone on steroids practically. So people, in fact, the New York Times now covers genre films, and they cover horror films. And this is something that they never treated seriously before. Joe was part of, his column in the news was very influential in bringing these fringe movies into the center and treating them with respect in terms of critiquing them and comparing them and codifying them and urging people to see this one or that one or to skip this one or the other one.
I think Joe Bob Briggs also played a significant role in that effort as well, of
Yes.
just, making people aware and not treating them as just garbage, but as movies worth watching and explaining why they're worth watching.
A lot of these films, including the new horror films today, they're a way to talk about social issues or sexual issues or things that are on people's mind in a way that is less direct than a documentary or a political expose. It's done in a fictional mode, but the themes are there, and that's been true of racial themes that were played that way in some outre films in the 60s, where they were really trying to show a better way forward to racial integration and to stop segregation. And if you look back on those movies, The Other is important. And what they're really talking about is social issues but it's done in a way that in fantasy or in sci-fi or in a made-up story. And so there's always a place for that. And I think the environment has become attuned to it to the point where it doesn't even need to be discussed anymore, and any film is just welcome.
Nancy, let's talk about VideoScope's current editorial needs. How far ahead do you, issue-wise, do you work? And tell us a little bit about the kinds of articles you're most interested in from freelance contributors, the different areas of the magazine that are open to us.
Well, I like to try to I think every editor tries to have what they call something in the drawer, which means at any time some article that you plan falls apart, you don't have it. So you want to be sure you're not caught short. So I like to work way ahead. Right now the spring issue is well underway. I'm thinking of summer, and I'm also thinking of the fall issue, which is our annual horror issue. The way VideoScope works is this: we have a tremendous number of reviews. And these are reviews of films that are available in any whatever format now, whether it's Blu-ray, DVD, or it's on one of these streaming sites. We're interested in film reviews of genre films, and for our I call them our Q&As, our interviews. I'm interested in anybody who's you mentioned, Dawn, some wonderful people that you interviewed. I'm interested in behind the scenes people, what people's connection is to the making of a film. For example, I was on a movie set once and hanging around waiting to interview someone. So while I was waiting for when they could talk to me, I sat down at a table and a whole bunch of people there. And before I knew it, I got into a discussion with them, hi, what are you doing here? And I found out I was seated at a table of professional extras. And so I couldn't help myself. I said, how's it all work? How do you get to be an extra? And what's it all about? And so one guy said to me, a lot of people become extras because they want to begin their career and advance, and they see it as a stepping stone. He said, I didn't go to college. And he said, I regret it. And he said, I never knew I regretted it until I became an extra. And he said, I fell into being an extra through a friend of mine, and I didn't even know what to do, but they told me what to do. And the next thing I knew, I was learning how to eat and pretend to eat food in a restaurant. And I would walk down the street. Now I know how to stroll and how to eat. He said, I love doing this. He said, but that's not what's happened. He said, I'm not, he was older. He said, I didn't look to advance my career. I look to become exactly what I am, a professional extra. In fact, I wish I could interview this guy. This guy would be great. He said, what this job has given me is I've learned about how to look at a story, because they talk to us about motivation, character development, what it means when you look a certain way, how you can show emotion. He said, these were things I never considered before. And that's why, he said, I so wish I could be younger and go back to college and get a full and really spend time with this. He said, but this has opened up my life. He said, I would think of doing nothing else but what I am. And he said proudly, I'm a professional extra. So if someone could bring us a story like that, that's so off beaten track, but it's such a human story connected to cinema. That's terrific. Or a story about, we ran a story once on, this is topical, the armorer, the person who's in charge of guns, swords, all the weaponry on movies. And they have to keep, especially on these big budget films, they have to keep exact control over every sword. And this, with the tragedy that happened with that film set where the director was shot, guns, what kinds of it's fascinating what munitions are used. Are they real? Are they not real? This armorer was fantastic. So I like I guess you would call that craft stories. These are the crafts that are involved with movie making. We've never done this, but I would love to have someone who does costumes. I reviewed Mel Gibson directed Apocalypto. I don't know if anyone's seen this film, but it takes place.
Great movie.
It's fantastic, and it takes place in Central America, and he couldn't get any funding for it, so he paid for it out of pocket. and he just took he bet that it would be good, and in order to dress the actors, including the extras, he hired hundreds of makeup people, and they put on fake tattoos and fake gold, what looked like fake gold on their teeth to approximate how people at the time of Columbus in Central America, native indigenous people decorated themselves and their bodies. And I would love to find out, talk to a person who does that kind of makeup on that kind of body transformation, or someone who's a costumer who decides what's the look of a movie going to be. Some movies, the costumer decides, we're just going to have earth tones. It's all going to be brown and gray and charcoal, and they have to come up with the costumes that fit that scheme, and why they decide that the mood of the film should be muted like that. Or it may be a sci-fi film. How do they decide the sets? There's now, in the VideoScope world, people are very interested in FX, and they're interested in like someone like Savini, who's made up monsters and how people, what monsters look like. In Fangoria, another publication, was very into FX and makeup. But I'm interested in, and I think our readers would be interested in every aspect of the film. Who does what? How does it get done? And how do you keep track of all these costumes? I mean, if you have an actor who has 6 changes of costume and they rip their shirt, how's it all stay together? How many shirts do you have? Who's sewing them? Where do you keep them? If you go from location to location, how do you transport them? This is like moving every day. This is stuff you don't think of when you just see the film. I find it fascinating.
I do too. And one of the most fun craft articles that I did for VideoScope was with Foley artist Gary Hecker, who's worked on some of the biggest movies over the last 15 years. And he's talking about things about how he was doing the sound effects for Superman's cape and everything that went into that particular sound. And it was one of the most fascinating and interesting interviews I've ever done. And I found it so interesting, I turned around and I re-interviewed him for Boys Life magazine, which was really interesting.
That was a great article. That really was a great article. He told all his inside tricks about how to make sound. And then he'd even say, well, when I was stumped and I didn't know what could approximate the sound that I'm looking for, how he would try stuff out and throw things around and see what he'd get.
Just household stuff that was in his studio, and it was really amazing. Nancy, if someone is interested in reviewing some movies for you, what's the process?
Well, the best way would be to just drop me an email. I'll give you my email, and send me an email and say, I'd like to review this film, and just give me a couple of sentences on why this film is of interest to you. It might be I saw it when I was a kid. Now I saw it again, and I had a completely new interpretation of it. I'm particularly interested in the actor in it for this reason, because, or whatever it is, why it is you want to write a review. Now, I mentioned this. One of the rigors of print, and this is true whether it's a boutique magazine like ours or a huge magazine, magazine with a huge circulation, is the tyranny of the word count. The column is only so big, and the review can only be so long, and it's tough. It's really a skill to learn to write to length, and that's something that our younger writers have tremendous difficulty with, because they're so used to an open-ended article, an open-ended length for like online writing. What does it matter whether the piece is 350 words or 550? If it's all online, what's the difference? It's only about this much space, and your eye can follow it. But if you're in a column, a print column, there's only room, say, for 450 words. If you have 550 words have to come out. They just have to come out. So our reviews, I would think of writing for to pitch a review. Think of a review as about no more than 400 words. And that's almost a relief, because a 400-word review is manageable. That's almost like in an old manuscript page. It's like 2 pages on the computer screen. And it could be less even. And if you think about it that way, then it helps you arrange your little setup, how to get into the piece, get your main points across, get some observations in, and then do your sum up. So you have like a sense of okay, I got this amount of space and this is how I'm going to fill it.
You also assign work. You've thrown assigned since the resurrection of the magazine. You've offered me a number of assignments. I was curious what your thought process is as far as making assignments. I know, I've also pitched and you've said yes to some of my ideas, but when they're your ideas, how do you decide which writers to assign them to?
Well, let me first tell you about ideas. When I decided to start the magazine, we had stopped publishing because of my husband's death, and also because during the height of COVID, all magazine distribution ceased. I can't tell you, Joe was alive when this happened. We got an email that said all distribution has ceased. Don't send us any more magazines. We're on hold. This was like a death knell to us. We had never received an email like that ever, and Barnes and Noble, all the retail stores closed. So when we started up, it had been over a year since the magazine had been around, and the distributors, the film companies were no longer sending me any product for review. I was starting from scratch, and I kept thinking, Joe had left for an issue that we never completed together. He had left a couple of interviews and some reviews, which I picked up. But I was looking at these empty pages and I was saying, well, we got to think up some ideas here, like immediately. For the last issue, we had been friendly and had spent with Bruce Goldstein at Film Forum. And I thought, we've never done a piece on a repertory theater. Let's do that. So I contacted him and they were agreeable. But
why did you give that to me, Nancy? You
okay.
have a large corral of writers, but you gave that to me. And I was curious why, because it was a little outside my usual area of coverage for the magazine.
Did you enjoy doing it?
Very much so. Bruce was a fascinating guy. We had some wonderful conversations about favorite movies, and his job as a scheduler for film festivals, how he decides the movies, his thought process. It was really interesting. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, he's a nice guy too. He's fun to talk to. He has a nice style where he can make jokes and he can make you laugh, and it's fun. And that is fun.
Extraordinarily knowledgeable.
Well, we have some writers who are steeped in horror films, and they know the lineages of the franchises, and they've seen them. And so if we're going to interview someone who's involved with horror films, either a director or an actor, I'll go to the horror expert. For a piece like the Film Forum piece, I think that you have such experience and range with having dealt with so many topics, film related and not film related, that you are a fantastic interviewer. So you know how to start a conversation with somebody. And the trick is you let them talk a little bit, like you're letting me talk a little bit and a lot. And then what happens is the conversation takes off, and a good interviewer thinks on their feet. And based on what the subject is saying, it suggests new topics that may not be the ones that you went into the interview thinking you were going to ask, but something new has come up, and you immediately tease out more information to see where it's going to go. And if it doesn't go anywhere, you know how to bring the conversation back to what you know your article should be and try to get more information. And I think that you're very skilled at it. You've done a lot of interviews and you've interviewed a lot of different types of people. So my thinking was, like you say, Bruce is a little off the beaten path, and he has the Film Forum going, but I know Don can get something going with him. So Don's the person. That was my thought process.
I appreciate that so much, yeah. Nancy. You're far too kind, but
No.
It was a great, and Arlene Sedaris, the movie producer, was also off my beaten path, but she too was great fun to talk to. I really enjoyed that. I appreciate you thinking of me for those kinds of pieces.
Well, here's something else. The more you get off your beaten path, the better you are at anything, whether it's writing or gardening. It doesn't matter. If you're only growing roses and suddenly you realize that there's some small part of your garden and you want to do something else with it, suddenly you're involved with that, and suddenly you can become an expert in that area too. So I'm all for taking on anything. You don't know where it's going to take you, and it will expand your ability to be a better writer and a better interviewer. That's my philosophy.
That's an awesome philosophy, and I agree with that very much. Now, VideoScope is a small magazine, but it is a paying market.
Yes.
Tell us a little, what is your fee structure?
Do you mean our advertising?
No, I mean, what you pay your writers.
Well, I have to be honest. This is painful to tell you. No one gets rich writing for VideoScope. It's painful. Our setup is this: we pay $75 for interviews, and mostly for reviews, we don't pay anything. I know that's very harsh because people like to be, including myself, compensated for their work. But the demand, the financial demands between the printing, the distribution, the various fees involved, that we've been running it on a sort of stripped down tight budget, and we're as guilty as anyone else, but the writers get treated the worst. That's a fact. Our rates are not terrific.
Well, I know that I write for the magazine, not for the money, although I do appreciate the $75, but because of the love of what I'm writing about. And I think that's pretty much true for the majority of the writers on your staff, that they are just deeply, deeply into movies, passionate about movies, and they enjoy, you give them a platform to talk about that. And I think that's important.
They're committed. And for some of our writers, we've launched some of these writers. Some of these writers approached years back, approached Joe cold and would submit reviews. And Joe's attitude was, I can't run this one, but please think of us again. And they would continue. And then he would publish one or two. And then some of them became our regular writers. But what some of the writers have told me was, especially the writers for whom VideoScope was their first publication, this is the first time they saw themselves in print. And if, like anybody, once you first see yourself in print, it's a thrill. From my perspective, it's a thrill like no other. And all it ever did for me was, I must have more of this, and this must happen on a regular basis, and I must look for other places where this can happen, and my credits must increase, and they must lead to books, and they must just keep geometrically increasing, and it's a thrill. That's my feeling, not everybody's, but mine. And some of our writers have told us that based on getting started with VideoScope, they were then able to move to other magazines, which we encourage, as long as there's no crossover of material. If the material is exclusive to VideoScope and the material is exclusive to another publication that they're writing for, that's the nature of being a freelancer. They moved on and have developed real writing careers. So that's another part of it too.
Nancy, do the rights to the articles revert to the writer, or we've never really discussed rights? It's never been an issue, but what is your thought on that?
Well, there used to be something called North American rights. Does that, you know of that phrase?
Yeah, North American serial rights is how I know it.
I believe that means that you buy it for it to be in the publication, but that the person who wrote the piece owns it. So say for example, VideoScope ever put out an anthology of reviews. We would go to the writers and say, you wrote the piece, do you give us permission to put it in this anthology? Usually people say yes. Now, if someone came to us and said, I wrote a review 5 years ago, and another anthology from some other company has asked me, can I contribute that review? Maybe it's a book about a certain director, an anthology of everything connected to that director, and they want my review in it. And they came to us, and our answer would be, you own the piece. Yes, you can do it, but you should say it was first published in VideoScope. That's what you have to say. It was where it was first published.
That's the fair thing. Nancy, share your email with us, please.
Sure, my email. Yeah, I'll say it, then I'll spell it. It's Fan Media. That's PHANMEDIA @AOL.com.
That's how you can reach Nancy. Nancy, I love talking with you. I wish we lived closer so I could buy you a beer and talk movies late into the night. I would enjoy that. This has been wonderful talk. I'd like to open it up to audience questions if you could give us an extra couple minutes.
Oh, sure.
Does anyone have any questions for Nancy, or about VideoScope, or about her husband Joe, or her own writing?
And if nobody has any questions, maybe someone wants to just share with us what what their 1 or 2 or 3 favorite films of all time are.
Sure.
I'm always interested in what people's favorite film is.
I'll start. I'm going to go with I've got a bunch of them. I'm deep into movies, but one of my all-time favorite movies is The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, with special effects by Ray Harryhausen. I'm a real big fan of Eugene Laurie's work.
Anybody else? I can just tell you this little vignette. Sometimes Joe and I people would talk about what was the first really scary movie that you saw that frankly, probably in childhood, upset you for quite a while. It was like maybe too scary for you because you were too young for it, or you didn't assimilate it, or whatever. And the film I always cite is Them, THEM, about giant ants. Anybody see this film? It's about ants.
That's a great movie.
So let me tell you
James
something
Whitmore
funny
is
about.
awesome in that movie.
Let me tell you something very funny about Them. When it came back out on VHS or whatever, Joe and I were watching it, and I still was nervous about it. I saw it when I was too young, and it terrified me. And when those ants came, I still wasn't happy to see them. So we listened to the commentary, and we noticed this. The cars it takes place in the desert, and the cars are driving through the desert. And on the hood of the car, it looks like there's a suitcase strapped onto the hood of the car. And suddenly, because we could stop for the first time, we could stop the film and look at this. We got into a big discussion about, is this suitcase connected to them, to the ants? I mean, is this something we missed? Is it like poison for the ants? What's this got to do with the ants? Why would they carry a suitcase on top of the car like this? We still didn't know. So we listened to the commentary. In the commentary, they start talking about how hot the desert was. And in the desert at that time, if you were driving in the desert, you carried a water bag strapped to the hood, because is this familiar to someone about driving in the desert? Because your car could overheat, your radiator, the water would bubble up, steam up, and you'd have to pull over. And if you didn't have any water, you could be marooned out there. So everybody carried their own water. So Joe and I got into these esoteric discussions about how this was somehow connected to the ants. It has nothing to do with the ants. It has everything to do with how cars work.
Well, Nancy, I can say that probably it's still my scariest of all time, but I watch it whenever I can. And well, I do it late at night, which is really silly. The Shining with Jack Nicholson. That movie scared me so much when the trailers would come on. I had to run and hide, and I would actually cover my ears so that I couldn't hear, the heavy breathing that he would do. And, of course, now I watch the movie now and I just laugh at myself.
No, it's a wonderful film, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
It's a wonderfully constructed film, and the performances and everything, and then the locale, the whole thing, it's just fantastic. I personally, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Nancy, go ahead.
Anybody like Lawrence of Arabia? I love Lawrence of Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
Hottest movie
I've watched it. I can watch it over and over.
He likes your lemonade. One of my favorite lines. Does anyone else have any questions or comments for Nancy?
Can I just say, Nancy, I've never actually read VideoScope. I've heard Dawn talk about it for probably a number of years now, but I am totally fascinated with this whole interviewing the people behind the scenes kind of thing. You had asked what our favorite movie was. One of my longtime favorites is The Lord of the Rings. And I bought the DVD sets when they came out with the collector DVD sets, and I must have watched like every behind the scenes thing, like every 15 hours they had of, just an insane amount of stuff. So I think it's really cool that you are keeping that alive in print, because that's very fascinating for some of us.
you know, these commentaries that come with these films now, they're just so instructive. Speaking of Lawrence of Arabia, the 50th anniversary edition came with, like you say, hours of extras. And one of the things that I learned in it, which I never would consider, is that when they were doing the scenes in the desert and there were, you know, take after take after take, you know what it's like. Someone misses a line, someone's not in the proper spot, anything can happen. Every time a take had to be taken over again, he had a crew of sweepers that would have to go up the sand dune and smooth out all that sand because there could be no footsteps except theirs. And this was what was slowing it up. And I thought, this is something I would never have considered. That's because I'm not involved with filmmaking that way. That kind, and I'm sure with Lord of the Rings, you learned a lot about that kind of behind the scenes stuff.
Yeah, it's fascinating because they talked, like you say, they talked about every aspect of it, everything from the costumes to the way they set up like Hobbiton, like the little town, you know, and the way they constructed it and grew the plants. You know, some of the special effects, or I guess it would be visual effects with the camera that they did to make the different sizes of the people. I mean, just like all kinds of stuff that you, like, as you say, you had no idea, and it wouldn't have even occurred to you that somebody would have had to thought about that, you know. So it's just blows your mind sometimes.
People forget how extraordinarily complicated movie making really is. And I think we tend to think of actors as divas and get paid huge amounts of money for not doing much of anything. But the reality is that they're up really early, they're working really late. I think a lot of actors, for the most part, really do earn their pay if you really understand exactly what their job entails. This is the latest issue, the current one on the stands of VideoScope. And this is the one that has my interview with Bruce Goldstein in it that Nancy mentioned earlier. You can find this at Barnes & Noble. I was at Briar Creek over the weekend to make sure that these issues were facing forward. Because it's all about shameless self-promotion. Before we let Nancy go,
let's hear it for Dawn.
Any last thoughts? Anyone at all? Nancy, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. And you know what, just as we're all sitting here chatting and the conversation flows this way and that, is once you start talking about movies, as you can see, everybody's seen movies and everybody has a different take on the same film. Everyone has a favorite. It's just a wonderful way to meet people and to hear and to get a feeling for where people are coming from and what their interests are. And it's a great icebreaker. People love it. That's why I think VideoScope is successful. It's a way to be part of a club where a bunch of people are sitting around talking about a topic they love. And it's endless. There's just no end to all the things that you can discover.
It's just a great way. We had a movie night with some friends a couple weekends ago when we watched Dark Star and Invasion of the Saucer Men, which made for a real interesting evening. You know, and that's what I like the community that films bring. You know, film really is a community. It's one thing all of us have in common.
Is Dark Star the film where there's a ball and then
that's the alien. It was Dan O'Bannon was involved in it, but it was John Carpenter's first movie.
And the character keeps saying ball. Because the ball is not too cooperative. It was a very upset alien that was actually a beach ball. I believe it was their college film project, actually. And Jack Harris picked it up and they added a little bit to it and released it theatrically. But what was interesting was the sentient bombs. The bombs talk to them and then you tell them when to explode. So it was an interesting movie. Like I said, Nancy, I could talk to you about this for hours and hours. The character is exasperated with the bomb and he says, bomb, bomb, like, oh, will you, come on, bomb.
It's not time to explode yet. Yeah, it's a great movie. It really is. Nancy, this was great fun. Again, our thanks for joining us. I hope you get some really good ideas from our members. I think they're really inspired. And my own experience has been very positive with this publication. So I do encourage you to pitch if you've got something good.
Well, thank you, everybody, and best of luck to everybody.
You have a great evening, Nancy.
Thank you.
I'll talk to you soon.